Good morning. Welcome to the first parts of the Williams HR Law three-part New World of Work Hotspot webinar series. We're kicking off our series with the hottest of hot topics for employers, that is COVID-19 vaccination and testing policies. This is a key issue that employers need to address and resolve in their return to work initiatives. On a daily basis, we are speaking to employers who are scrambling to implement vaccination policies, but are having some trouble doing so because the legal landscape is constantly changing and there's a lot of legal uncertainty as to how to implement these types of policies. There's also a lot of misunderstanding among employers as to whether they're required to implement mandatory vaccination requirements or have policies relating to vaccination. So we will get into some of those points in depth today. Before getting into any content though, I'll begin this webinar by recognizing today as the Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're presenting to you from land that is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We recognize and deeply appreciate the historic connection and contributions that these Indigenous peoples and cultures have had to this place that we're privileged to present to you from today. With respect to the content, we will be taking your questions at the end of this presentation, so feel free to post any questions you may have in the Q&A section. Please understand that given this is an educational session, we're not providing legal advice during this session. Please place any questions you have about technical issues, though, in the chat function below, not the Q&A function, the chat function below. Keep any content-related questions in the Q&A box. Recognizing that we have hundreds of people joining us today and there will be numerous questions, we're prepared to stay on for an additional bonus Q&A time of 15 minutes. Please provide us with your questions as they arise throughout the presentation, rather than holding them to the end, so we can be sure to collate all the questions and respond to as many as possible. So without further ado, we'll get started here, and I'll start with some introductions. By way of introduction, my name's Seth Holland. I'm a lawyer and workplace investigator with Williams HR Law. I'm also presenting with my co-presenter here, Mark Wolfe, who's also a lawyer with Williams HR Law, and you'll hear from Mark a bit more in the coming minutes. So we'll start off just by giving an agenda, a sort of roadmap of what we're going to cover here. First, I'll start off giving an update on vaccinations, just very generally, some of the general trends that employers need to be aware of right now. Then we'll move on to the legal landscape, and Mark will be covering that. Some of the key legal developments we've seen in the area, provincial and local requirements that employers need to be aware of. Then we'll move on to key risk considerations or hotspots, where employers really can overlook certain liability and where vaccination policies could go wrong, so to speak. Then we'll finalize the presentation before Q&A, talking about strategies and best practices for employers and how to implement vaccination policies and what key elements should be in those policies. So getting right into it, we'll start with just a vaccination update, some of the general trends that we're seeing that employers really need to have on their radar at this time as they return to work and they start considering implementing these vaccination policies. What are some things that should be on your radar? First, at a glance, national update. We're seeing nearly 80% of eligible Canadians are now vaccinated as of September. We've seen a significant uptick following the introduction of vaccination passports in many provinces. Public health guidelines do continue to apply, something that's a bit of an ambiguity right now, but employers should be clear of. Even if your workplace is completely vaccinated, you have a completely vaccinated workplace, that does not absolve you from complying with other COVID-19 related guidelines and recommendations by your province or your local jurisdiction. Otherwise, you could be subject to fines and penalties. Mandatory vaccinations are also starting to be legislated in the federal sector. We've seen the public federal sector have a mandatory vaccination requirement implemented. We've also seen certain provinces implement mandatory vaccination requirements for those working with vulnerable populations, so certain sectors. We will get into that a bit more in Mark's part of the presentation. Also, vaccination passports, I touched on it a bit. Many provinces now, Ontario, BC, Alberta, just to name a few examples, have implemented vaccination passport systems, which have been obviously very controversial. But important to note for employers, these only apply to patrons. They don't apply to the employment relationship. Mark will get into this in much more detail in the coming minutes. So moving on here, we'll touch on just more generally, what are some benefits of a vaccination policy? So even if you're not legally required to have a vaccination policy as an employer, what are some of the benefits of doing so? The first may be obvious and come to mind for many employers: health and safety benefits, preventing the spread of COVID-19 in your workplace, as well as easing some of that employee anxiety of returning to the workplace. Maybe knowing that others are vaccinated in the workplace could help ease that transition for some employees. It also helps because vaccinations are now becoming more commonplace and viewed as a necessary step for employers to meet their health and safety obligations in the return to work context. Next, relatedly, protecting vulnerable populations. So as I mentioned, certain sectors involving work with vulnerable populations does require mandatory vaccinations at this time. But if you're not in one of those sectors and you work with vulnerable populations, obviously implementing a vaccination policy could have some benefit for your line of work. Next, reducing claims related to COVID-19. So many employers will know that an outbreak of COVID-19 in the workplace could have significant repercussions with respect to your operations. As well, COVID-19 related claims could result in increased costs for employers by way of workplace injury claims or disability claims. So implementing a vaccination policy would help there. Lastly, competitive advantage in business. So we're starting to see in our work businesses asking to implement vaccination policies that apply beyond their immediate workplace. So to contractors, service providers, anyone who does work in the workplace. So as a result of these trends, in some cases, actually not implementing vaccination policies could limit your ability as a business to work with certain clients, depending on the sector you're within. Another point I'll raise, it's not on the slide, but setting expectations around conduct is also a benefit of a vaccination policy. We're starting to see a drastic uptick in inappropriate harassment, discrimination claims from employees related to vaccination status. So a policy can really assist an employer in setting expectations around conduct and having a grounds to discipline an employee when necessary. So that wraps up just the sort of general background around vaccinations. I'm going to turn it over to Mark now to touch on some of the key legal areas where we've seen development that relate to vaccinations. So take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Seth. So diving into some specific legal developments that we've seen lately, I mean, these things have been coming fast and furious, and it's been really difficult for employers to keep up. So right off the top, currently most employees are not legally required to be vaccinated against COVID-19. The exception to this, as Seth mentioned, is certain government employees are required to be vaccinated, as well as employees working in certain federally regulated industries. So this includes industries like federally regulated air, rail, marine transportation sectors. On the other hand, provincially regulated employees are not legally required to be vaccinated in Ontario or in any other Canadian jurisdiction. Nonetheless, provincially regulated employers are increasingly being required to implement COVID-19 vaccination policies, which must generally contain certain prescribed elements. For example, the Ontario government amended a regulation in August such that all Ontario employers are now required to follow any recommendations, advice, or instructions from the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health or local medical officers of health with respect to businesses and organizations implementing and ensuring compliance with COVID-19 vaccination policies. Therefore, where a medical officer of health for any given public health region has recommended that employers in that region have a COVID-19 vaccination policy with certain elements, that recommendation is actually a legal requirement. And again, these policies must contain any components that the applicable medical officer of health recommends or instructs employers to include in them. So moving on, as I noted before, the medical officers of health in certain Ontario public health regions have already recommended that employers in those regions implement COVID-19 vaccination policies, and these often have to include certain elements. For example, in Toronto on August 20th, Toronto's medical officer of health released a statement in which she strongly recommended that all Toronto employers institute COVID-19 workplace vaccination policies. Further, she strongly recommended that these policies require at minimum the following: Workers must provide proof of any COVID-19 vaccinations that they have received, which have been approved by Health Canada or the World Health Organization. Unvaccinated employees must provide written proof of any medical reasons that prevent them from being vaccinated, which must be provided by a physician or a nurse practitioner. And unvaccinated workers must complete an educational course regarding the risks of not being vaccinated in the workplace and the benefits of being vaccinated against COVID-19, among other requirements. Similarly, for the Peel region on August 26th, the region of Peel announced that it would require all employees in the region to disclose and provide documentation of their COVID-19 vaccination status, and that employers would have to have policies in effect by the end of October. Employees who are not fully vaccinated in the Peel region will be required to complete educational programming about the benefits of COVID-19 vaccination, and they'll need to regularly be tested for COVID-19 and to provide proof of negative test results to their employer. On the other hand, we have some regions like York region where the medical officer of health has yet to impose any vaccination policy requirements on employers in that region. So given the regional variability that we're seeing here, all Ontario employers should determine whether there are any vaccination policy requirements for their public health region. And if there aren't any already, they should still continue monitoring because new requirements may be introduced soon. These things have been coming out with very little notice, and the trend has been that more and more jurisdictions are introducing these types of requirements. Additionally, Ontario's Chief Medical Officer of Health has introduced vaccination policy requirements for employers across the province of Ontario that operate in certain industries such as healthcare, childcare, and education sectors. In these sectors, employers must implement and enforce vaccination policies, which must require all employees to provide proof of full vaccination, proof of medical reason that prevents them from being vaccinated, or completion of an educational session regarding COVID-19 vaccinations. Further, all unvaccinated employees in these sectors must undergo regular antigen testing, and the frequency of that testing varies by sector. So, these requirements have been coming out with such short notice. We've had a lot of panicked phone calls from, for example, I've had a lot of childcare clients, and they introduced these new requirements for childcare centers on September 7th, and technically they were supposed to have a policy in place the same day the requirements were announced. So obviously this has been a very challenging time for employers, and that's part of the reason it's so important to keep monitoring for new updates. So now turning to kind of an overview of a few different provinces here. There are similar sector-specific requirements that have been implemented or will be implemented in certain other Canadian jurisdictions, such as BC, Manitoba, and New Brunswick. So for British Columbia, on August 31st, BC's Provincial Officer of Health issued an order which applies to long-term care facilities, certain hospitals, and assisted living residences. And unvaccinated workers in these sectors must wear a mask and undergo regular testing. On the other hand, in Alberta, vaccinations and vaccination policies are not currently mandatory for any workplaces. For Manitoba, they actually had an announcement on August 24th, and the Manitoba government said that it will require all employees who work with vulnerable populations in a number of different industries to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19, or they need to undergo regular COVID-19 testing. Again, we have Nova Scotia, where there's currently no vaccination-related requirements for any workplaces for the time being. That obviously could change. Moving on to New Brunswick, currently only provincial government employees in New Brunswick have to provide proof of full vaccination or wear a mask and undergo regular testing. And we are also seeing the introduction of vaccination passports and proof of vaccination requirements for patrons, as Seth alluded to earlier. So this is obviously an important new legal requirement that's impacting a lot of employers, particularly those who are now required to ensure that patrons are fully vaccinated or subject to an exemption before entering their business. So as Seth mentioned, these requirements generally only apply to patrons and customers. They don't apply to employees or contractors. And as you can see, Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Quebec have all either implemented these types of requirements or they will be doing so soon. For example, we have Ontario where now, patrons must show proof of vaccination in order to enter a number of publicly accessible settings unless they can't be vaccinated for protected human rights reasons. And these settings include places like bars and restaurants, nightclubs, meeting and event spaces, facilities used for sports and fitness activities such as gyms, sporting events, casinos, concerts, racing venues, and even more than that. So, in these jurisdictions, the patrons need to show the proof that they, in certain jurisdictions, patrons can actually show proof of a negative COVID-19 test rather than proof of vaccination. So this would include provinces such as Alberta and Saskatchewan. Overall, this adds another consideration for employers as their operations and services to patrons will be impacted by vaccination passport requirements, and they need to ensure that they have appropriate practices, policies, and procedures in place to ensure that their employees are checking that people are fully vaccinated or have proof of an exemption before they enter the workplace. This is necessary so that the employers can ensure that they're meeting their legal obligations. And with that, I will turn it back over to Seth.
Thanks very much, Mark. And just before I move on to some of the key risk considerations, hotspots for employers, just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please do post them in the Q&A section of the webinar below, not the chat function, the Q&A, there's two there. Just a reminder, please post the questions as they arise. If you post the question at the end, we may have too many, and we just want to make sure we get to as many questions as we possibly can. So please post them as they arise. So I'll get into some of the key risk considerations here. So Mark mentioned the legal landscape. He mentioned where certain sectors, depending on the nature of the work you do, you may have to have a mandatory vaccination requirement in your workplace. If you don't, implementing a mandatory vaccination policy does come with some risk, right? From an employment law perspective, there's a number of key considerations that employers need to make before jumping into a mandatory vaccination requirement. The first, the big one, constructive dismissal. It does remain to be seen whether a mandatory vaccination requirement could provide an employee with a basis to claim a constructive dismissal. Taking a step back, many employers are probably familiar with the concept, but a constructive dismissal is an employment law concept. Generally occurs when an employer makes a unilateral change to a fundamental term or condition of employment. In the context, when such a change is made, though, an employee is essentially entitled to resign from their employment, claim that their employment has been terminated, and bring a claim against the company or the employer for their termination entitlements, which could range anywhere from a week to 2 years worth of payout for the employee. So the issue here and how constructive dismissal sort of is at play with vaccination policies is that for existing employees, they didn't contemplate vaccinations when they first started with the employer. So an employee who does not want to get vaccinated could potentially allege that introducing a mandatory vaccination requirement constitutes a fundamental change to a fundamental term of their employment and therefore has resulted in a constructive dismissal. Now, we haven't seen case law on this subject to this point. COVID-19 and vaccinations specifically are a fairly novel legal issue. However, the legal risk does exist there for employers. There are some steps, though, that employers can take to mitigate the risks of constructive dismissal liability. I'll get into a bit of those. The first thing to consider is the reasonableness of the policy. That is always a factor that an adjudicator is going to consider when considering the legality of a vaccination policy. Now, when considering the reasonableness of the policy, this could be related to the justification, essentially, for implementing mandatory vaccination. That could be related to health and safety considerations. It could also be related to operational considerations, right? Because depending on the nature of your business, you may have regular travel requirements for certain employees who could ultimately be bogged down by quarantine requirements if they're not vaccinated. And also employers who do regular work on client sites, right? Because as I mentioned before, more and more employers are now implementing policies that require anyone on site to be vaccinated. So as an employer, if you have certain employees who are unvaccinated, that's going to cause a serious operational issue for you and potentially justify having a mandatory vaccination requirement. The stronger these sorts of justifications are, that you have to back a mandatory vaccination policy, the more likely it is you're going to have your policy upheld if challenged by an employee. Another important note when we're talking about constructive dismissal, the distinction between new and existing employees. A constructive dismissal analysis wouldn't apply to a new employee. So it's fine for an employer to have as a term and condition for a new employee the requirement that they do be vaccinated, and they wouldn't have to worry about that constructive dismissal risk. That risk only applies to existing employees, where the terms and conditions of the employment are being changed by the vaccination requirement. Moving off of constructive dismissal in the non-union context and into the unionized workforce, there are also risks associated with implementing vaccination policies in unionized settings. The risk being that depending on the language in your collective agreement, implementing a vaccination policy may actually fall outside of your management rights. And there may be some procedural requirements or obstacles in that document of your ability to implement such a vaccination requirement. So if you're dealing with a unionized workforce, you'll want to assess these potential legal risks, assess all relevant documents, collective agreement, and assess the obstacles of implementing a vaccination policy, or else you could be on the wrong side of a grievance in a fight with the union that you're involved with. Moving on to additional key risk considerations. The first is a big one as well, human rights liability and accommodation. If a worker is unable to get vaccinated in relation to grounds covered under human rights legislation, so for example, the Human Rights Code in Ontario, that employer is required to accommodate the employee to the point of undue hardship. So the human rights grounds that employers, though, need to be aware of when we're talking about vaccinations specifically are that of disability, so a medical condition that prevents an employee from getting vaccinated, or religion or creed. So as vaccination policies have become more commonplace, I can tell you we've seen an influx of claims from employees for accommodation on those two bases. So creed, religion, and disability. It isn't uncommon as well at this time to see accommodation requests that don't necessarily qualify under their respective human rights grounds and meet that legal threshold requiring an accommodation. Note that it's very important for employers to sort of keep track of the trends here in this area, because the government has provided guidance with respect to these vaccination exemptions that employers should be aware of when they're considering accommodation requests. Specifically in Ontario, just last week, the Ministry of Health provided a guidance document on medical exemptions to the COVID-19 vaccination. This provides specifically what medical conditions would qualify an employee for a medical exemption from vaccination. Often in the normal context, we see medical notes from doctors that sort of stretch the extent of an employee's medical limitations in favor of the employee. In the context of vaccinations exemptions, I can tell you we're already seeing from our client work, doctors are hesitant to provide medical exemption letters where the employee's condition doesn't meet those ministry guidelines on what exemptions apply. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that an accommodation wouldn't be required if a medical condition didn't fall within one of those ministry guideline sections. However, it's certainly going to be a relevant development for employers when they're considering whether accommodation is appropriate or possible in the circumstances. So that speaks to disability. With respect to creed, the government's also introduced some guidance. The Ontario Human Rights Commission also last week released a statement on COVID vaccines and explicitly stated that a singular belief or personal preference against vaccinations or mask wearing does not amount to a creed or religious belief that would trigger those accommodation obligations under human rights legislation. So as the vaccination situation continues to evolve, we continue to see development and statements from government agencies on vaccinations and exemptions that may apply. In any case, employers will be best advised to seek legal advice. Every accommodation situation needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Health and safety obligations, we did touch on that earlier. Just note, even if your workplace is completely vaccinated, that does not absolve you from complying with any other COVID-19 related guidelines and regulations. So as an employer, you need to continue to keep an eye on those. Next, privacy considerations. Depending on your jurisdiction, There may be employee information legislation that specifically governs the way an employer is supposed to intake and deal with employee information, right? So specifically BC and Alberta are examples where specific legislation applies. So if you're operating within one of those provinces, you need to ensure that your policies comply with those specific information requirements. More generally though, all Canadian employers could be subject to liability where they allow the misuse or mismanagement of personal information of employees related to vaccination or testing even. So it's very important that as an employer, you have strict handling practices over vaccination and testing information. Ideally, an employer will centralize the collection and holding of this information in its human resources department, if that's possible to do so. Next, I'll talk about side effects. So one important point to note here is that depending on your province, a mandatory vaccination policy could actually lead to workplace injury claims. So if an employee receives a side effect that requires them to take time off work, an employer would have to deal with that as if it was a workplace injury claim. Relatedly, so if you're not covered under your provincial workers' compensation scheme in your province, you could actually be subject to other legal claims from employees for side effects they receive as a result of a vaccination. So these claims could potentially be substantial if the employee can show that they only got vaccinated because of a mandatory policy that you had in place, right? Depending on the nature of the employee's injury or illness and how long they're going to be off work. However, while this is a risk, it's a hypothetical risk, but they'll want to weigh it with the potential benefits of implementing a vaccination policy in their workplace. Lastly, I'll touch on harassment and conduct issues. I did mention in our work, we've seen a sharp increase in the amount of harassment, discrimination claims we've seen that relate to vaccination status. That result to as a result of someone being upset at someone being unvaccinated or feeling that they shouldn't be working next to them, and inappropriate conduct and comment that was made in relation to that. It sort of mirrors the friction we're seeing more generally in the public sphere between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. So this is something that employers should get ahead of, be proactive about. Employers should be leveraging policies and roll out training to set expectations around conduct as it relates to vaccination. And specifically that employees understand that it's inappropriate to mistreat or bully an employee in relation to their vaccination status. So moving on, we did talk about mandatory vaccination policies. Mark did touch on certain sectors that require mandatory vaccination policies. What if you, as an employer, it's always an option to you to implement something short of a mandatory vaccination policy, right? And go for an alternative, right? That is sort of less drastic, if you will, than a mandatory vaccination. The first, very common right now, COVID-19 testing, right? The use of rapid antigen testing, for example, is very common right now as an alternative to vaccination in the workplace. But the use of testing does raise considerations that's similar to a vaccination policy. The first is you need to determine how often you're going to be asking employees to get tested and show their testing results, and what type of testing that you're going to have them undergo. Next, you're going to want to consider who will be receiving the test results. Where are they going to go? What are the handling practices around that information, and who's going to be ensuring that the information is not misused or accessed by anyone who doesn't need to know the information. Lastly, testing expectations should be laid out clearly for staff, ideally in policies and procedures that make it clear what the expectations are. And ideally, employees should be given as much advanced notice of these procedures as possible. It should be noted that, like mandatory vaccination policies, employers could receive pushback from employees and even claims for constructive dismissal for a mandatory testing policy being implemented. But testing requirements, if provided reasonably, given the context of the workplace, and again, that objective rationale for the policy, and with sufficient notice to an employee, stand a far greater chance of withstanding legal challenge than a mandatory vaccination policy. Not to say that a mandatory vaccination policy is unenforceable, just a testing policy should be seen as a less intrusive means on an employee's bodily autonomy. Next, also an alternative to mandatory vaccination is targeting certain roles for vaccination. For example, this could apply to employees who interact with vulnerable populations, for example, those who are required, again, to travel as part of their jobs. Also, those who are working in the office versus those who can work remotely. These are all options that employers have when drafting their vaccination policies. But in doing so, employers will want to ensure that there's the rationale and the objective basis is clear to employees when they're rolling out these types of rules. As an organization, you'll want to conduct a risk assessment prior to making these types of policies and distinctions, and ensure that the positions that are required to be vaccinated, there's actually an objective health and safety operational basis for doing so. Note, though, that when you are making these distinctions, be wary of any direct or indirect human rights considerations or discriminatory impact that they could have. So considering any positions that are dominated by a certain age group or a certain sex, ensuring that that doesn't necessarily come into play when you're implementing these requirements. Next, use of PPE or modified work assignments. That's also an option as an alternative to mandatory vaccination. Essentially, this involves using protective or preventative measures to mitigate the risk of spread of COVID-19 for those who are unvaccinated, limiting unvaccinated employees to low-risk areas of your business. In doing so, though, employers should consider how to minimize the stigma of additional protective measures, such as mask wearing, working in certain areas of the business where it becomes conspicuous to everyone who is vaccinated or unvaccinated. Employers should be sure to be cognizant to roll these types of policies out in ways that don't isolate, don't stigmatize unvaccinated workers, to again avoid those harassment and discrimination claims that we're seeing more and more of now. Lastly, as an alternative, where an employer, based on a risk assessment, does have reason to believe that keeping an unvaccinated employee at work creates an unreasonable health and safety or operational risk, employers may make use of a leave of absence, right? Leaving an employee on a leave of absence until they can determine whether it's safe for them to return. Note, though, that this option really should be used as a last resort for employers where it is being used as an alternative to mandatory vaccination, because it does carry some risk given the uncertainty and the financial instability it could place on an employee. It could result in a constructive dismissal claim from an employee who's placed on a leave of absence. So something to note, and probably should be near the end of considerations for alternatives for employers. So that wraps up the key risk considerations for me. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Mark to talk about some of the best practices for employers when it comes to vaccination policies. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Seth. So I'll be giving you all an overview of best practices as to what should be included in a COVID-19 vaccination policy. So we'll just move on to the next slide here. And there we are. So depending on the jurisdiction or industry an employer is in, certain elements may be legally required to be in an employer's COVID-19 vaccination policy. Beyond that, there are certain elements that every COVID-19 vaccination policy should contain. All COVID-19 vaccination policies should clearly explain the purpose of the policy. So this is generally going to be, protecting health and safety of everyone at the business or organization and reducing the spread of COVID-19 to the greatest extent possible. Employers should also include, if there's any sort of workplace specific or role specific justifications for requiring certain individuals to be vaccinated, they should include that here as well, such as if certain workers work with vulnerable or other high-risk individuals. By making the purpose of the policy clear, you can help explain to employees why it's necessary to put these measures into place and help get buy-in from them when they understand, why this is really being done. These policies should also be clear on who they apply to. So obviously they should apply to employees, but employers should also consider, should this requirements also apply to contractors, third-party service providers, volunteers, visitors, really anyone else that might be in the workplace, given that the rationale here is obviously to protect health and safety. So, based on your workplace, it could be necessary to have the policy apply to these individuals as well. All COVID-19 vaccination policies should also clearly explain the employer's expectations and or requirements regarding vaccination. So this can include any number of things, such as whether vaccination is mandatory for new and or existing employees, contractors, and others with the business or the organization, whether unvaccinated workers will be subject to enhanced health and safety requirements, such as regular COVID-19 testing or use of additional PPE. And another example is, whether employees are required to disclose their vaccination status or provide proof that they can't be vaccinated for protected human rights reasons, even if vaccination is not actually required. The reason you'd want this is because by knowing who's vaccinated and who's not, an employer can better assess, what other health and safety measures might be necessary to implement in their workplace, and also to be able to comply with any legal requirements that differentiate between vaccinated and unvaccinated workers. So that is a measure that employers will often want to include. Another thing that should be included in all COVID-19 vaccination and policies is that the employees who cannot be vaccinated for protected human rights reasons will be provided with reasonable accommodations up to the point of undue hardship. Again, as Seth noted earlier, the accommodations that are going to be reasonable for any given employee are going to vary on a case-by-case basis, depending on the workplace, their role, the risks, and a number of other factors. So moving on, all COVID-19 vaccination policies should also include any supports that the employer will provide to employees to get fully vaccinated against COVID-19. So this could include things like paid time off to be vaccinated or when recovering from any side effects from vaccines, assistance with booking appointments, informational resources, really anything that the employer is doing to help get employees vaccinated, because this will encourage vaccination and thereby reduce the risks in your workplace. COVID-19 vaccination policies should also, make it clear that employees must not harass others based on their vaccination status, whether they're vaccinated or not, and they must not discriminate against those who cannot be vaccinated for protected reasons. Employers should also consider, prohibiting employees from asking one another about their vaccination status to prevent conduct issues and conflict in the workplace. As Seth noted, we've been seeing a lot more conflict, between those that are vaccinated and those are not. And you can have your policy allow people to voluntarily share the vaccination status, but given that some people won't want to share it, it is a good idea generally to, kind of head that off and prohibit employees from asking one another about their vaccination status. And similarly, a lot of employers have been seeing their employees be harassed or assaulted by, customers who are, when they're trying to enforce, proof of vaccination requirements to enter the business, or, PPE requirements even. So employers should consider, doing a workplace violence risk assessment. And, if there is any significant risks for their workplace, they should include some precautions in their policy to address those risks, to ensure that they're, taking every reasonable precaution to ensure the health and safety of their workers. COVID-19 vaccination policies should also include how employees' personal information regarding their vaccination status and any related documents will be kept confidential, and how and why it'll be collected, retained, and used. It's important to note that certain provinces do have privacy legislation that applies to personal information in the workplace. So employers should be, employers in those jurisdictions should ensure that, the privacy section of their policy meets all applicable requirements. Additionally, all COVID-19 vaccination policies should clearly address what the potential consequences are if employees or other people subject to the policy don't follow its requirements. So I'll be discussing this further in just a moment, but generally it's best to simply provide that, not failing to comply with any of the requirements, including but not limited to a mandatory vaccination requirement, may result in discipline up to and including termination of employment for cause. So turning now to non-compliance and the consequences for non-compliance. In the last few weeks, we have had so many clients reach out to us because they've had one or more employees who are just refusing to comply with their vaccination policy, and they don't know what to do about it. I had a panicked client email me this morning, and I had a quick call with them, because they're in the same situation here. So this is, something we're seeing increasingly right now. Unfortunately, this is a complex question, and it's more complex than many would think. There's a number of things that need to be considered when determining what the consequences are going to actually be in any given case. So first, one important consideration is whether the requirement that an employee is violating is also a legal requirement. Where they're violating a legal requirement, the consequences are generally going to be a bit different than if they're just violating a requirement under the policy. So, for example, if a childcare worker in Ontario is not vaccinated, they're legally required to complete an educational session and to do regular COVID-19 testing. If they refuse to do that, the employee can't be permitted to be in the workplace because they would be in breach of those legal requirements. So, they should be, ultimately, this will generally require placing them off work until they agree to comply with those legal requirements. But, notably, that does also create some legal risks, especially where the leave of absence is unpaid. This is because, where an employer has not reserved the right to lay off or suspend employees in their employment agreement, placing an employee off of work could constitute constructive dismissal. But arguably, in my view, where the reason they're being placed off of work is because they're violating a legal requirement or, otherwise just can't do their jobs because they aren't complying with those requirements, it's relative, it's not, the risk of constructive dismissal isn't too high because arguably it's not even really a change the employer has made. It's, a change the government has made by implementing those legal requirements, and that the employee is just effectively, refusing to do their job by not following those legal requirements. That said, there is still constructive dismissal risk. We are, really in uncharted waters here. The courts have yet to address many of the things that we're discussing today, and because of that, there's a lot of legal uncertainty. I would note that a lot of employers may be tempted to immediately terminate the employment of employees who refuse to follow their vaccination policy, but that's a decision that should not be made lightly. Where an employee violates a policy but not legal requirements, and where the fact that they're not following the policy doesn't really prevent them from doing their job, it's unlikely that there would be cause for termination. And generally, if the employer does want to terminate their employment, they would have to do it without cause. And where an employee is terminated without cause, they're entitled to receive their termination entitlements, which can be quite substantial and will vary depending on whether or not there's a termination clause in their employment agreement. So once again, we are really in a new era sort of here in terms of the law in this area, given that the courts have yet to speak on these issues. But, whether an employee can be terminated for cause for violating a vaccination policy, there's a few things that we can glean from our past experience and the precedents that we do have. Generally speaking, in my view, there's two main circumstances where there may be cause for dismissal. The first is where an employee is violating legal requirements, like the daycare example I gave earlier, or where the employee just cannot do their job because they're not complying with it. So an example of this is the TDSB actually recently introduced a policy where by November, if anyone who's not fully vaccinated by November 1st, or who doesn't have an exemption for medical or religious reasons, they won't be able to be in the TDSB premises. So for childcare centers that are located in TDSB schools, if their employees don't follow those requirements, they won't be allowed in the building. So even though it's not actually a legal requirement, it's just a requirement under the TDSB policy, these people won't actually be able to do their jobs if they don't get fully vaccinated or have an exemption. So that's another example of where it may be possible for there to be cause if they refuse to follow the policy requirements. Broadly, to establish cause for termination, employers should engage in progressive discipline first. As I'll discuss a bit more in a moment, this is something the courts generally like to see in order to uphold a termination for cause. But another potential angle on this is that it could be possible that where an employee refuses to comply with vaccination policy requirements, it could actually amount to what's known as frustration of contract. Frustration of contract is where a contract comes to an end because an unforeseeable event makes the contract impossible to perform. And in those circumstances, neither party would be considered to be at fault. It's uncertain if an employer could successfully say that there's frustration of contract where somebody refuses to follow their vaccination policy, but it's possible. We really, only time will tell. In my view, arguably, in those circumstances, the contract's not really impossible to perform if the employee is just choosing not to follow the requirements and there's, no medical or religious reason preventing them from being vaccinated. But, again, we'll have to wait and see once the courts finally weigh in on these issues. Where an employer chooses not to dismiss an employee right away for violating their vaccination policy, they should generally implement progressive discipline, especially if they may want to terminate for cause later. However, it is a little known fact to most employers that they actually have no common law right to discipline employees. Employers actually need to reserve the right to discipline employees in an employment agreement. So as a result, if an employer hasn't reserved the right and they discipline an employee anyway, it could constitute constructive dismissal. So, in light of everything I just said, I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of complexities in this area. And for that reason, we strongly encourage any employers dealing with employees who are refusing to abide by their vaccination policies to seek specific legal advice. And with that, I will turn it back over to Seth, and we will head into Q&A in just a moment.
Thank you, Mark. And that really caps off the substantive elements of our presentation. But as I mentioned, we are kicking it open for Q&A, probably to get the most out of the presentation. I mean, feel free to ask any questions you feel are necessary, and we'll answer to the best of our ability based on our knowledge and our work in this area over the last few months. So we've become quite intimately familiar with the subject. Just a reminder, though, for those who can't stay until the end of the Q&A, I'd like to announce it now. As I mentioned, this was the first part of our New World of Work webinar series. So really the idea here is to cover on the hot topics, things that employers sort of need to know in the return to work context in the new world of work, if you will. So today we did vaccinations. On October 28th. We will be dealing with employment standards in the new world of work. So specifically talking about remote work and employment standards considerations that could come into play there as they relate to employers. Then a month later, November 25th, we will start talking about evolving issues in workplace investigations. And like I mentioned, we are starting to see a sharp rise in the number of discrimination and harassment claims related to vaccination status, have a vaccination element to them. And with that, I'd also like to put on everyone's radar the In the Know. Our most recent, because escalations in the workplace have become such a hot issue recently, we've recently come out with our most recent In the Know special edition newsletter, specifically on workplace investigations. You can download it by accessing our website, www.williamshrlaw.com. You can just sign up and download right from the website. There's no charge. This newsletter covers a number of topics related to workplace investigations, essentials that employers really need to know about, whether it's conducting their own investigation or hiring a third party to come in and do an investigation for them, and what cases those are appropriate. So I encourage everyone to check it out. So with that, I'll invite Mark back onto the screen, and we can touch on some of the questions we've received here today. I can start with the first one, Mark, if you'd like. Are employers allowed to ask whether their employees are vaccinated? If the employee says no, are employers allowed to ask what the reason is? Are employers allowed to ask whether their employees are vaccinated? In most cases, they are allowed to ask whether employees are vaccinated. In fact, in some jurisdictions, you're actually required to get proof of vaccination from your employees. So I guess there's two ways of dealing with this. First, if it's a legal obligation, you're obligated actually to figure out whether your employees are vaccinated. If they have an exemption, you're obligated to figure out what the exemption is, what the basis is for that exemption, and that they have it. Next, if you implement vaccination policy, even when you're not legally required to do so, it certainly would be reasonable in most circumstances to require that an employee provide proof of vaccination indicating that they are vaccinated, as long as it's coached as a part of an employee meeting its health and safety obligations or any considerations related to its operational risks. If an employee says no, Our employer is allowed, though, to ask what the reason is. Certainly, as I said, if it's a legal requirement and an employee refuses to get vaccinated, well, then there's a problem. We're at an impasse because the employee is required to get vaccinated. And if they don't have a substantial reason protected under human rights grounds for not getting vaccinated, that will become a relevant topic, and employers will need to get that vaccine or that exemption accommodation information, whether it be a medical note from a doctor or information that shows that the employee has a legitimately held creed basis or religious basis to not get vaccinated. So absolutely, when it's legally required, employers are allowed to ask what the reason is. And again, if it's not legally required, if it's a part of a larger vaccination policy, absolutely an employer would be required actually to look into what that medical exemption or that exemption accommodation requirement is, and get the reasons there. So the short answer is it depends, or the long answer is sort of complicated because it really depends on the circumstances. But in most cases, an employer would be able to get that vaccination information from their employees. So Mark, maybe I'll kick it off to you for the second question, if you'd like me to read it for you.
Sure. I did have just one point to add on that last question. I totally agree with everything Seth just said there. I would just note that, when it comes to medical accommodation requests or people who say they can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, generally all you need is a doctor's note indicating that they cannot or should not be vaccinated. Generally it's considered improper and could create liability if an employer asks or requires an employee to disclose a particular medical diagnosis. I would also note that there are some guidelines for certain regions which seem to imply that employers should be asking what the specific diagnosis is, but we would recommend exercising a lot of caution, and that should generally be avoided.
Yes.
So.
Totally agreed. And to that point, actually, if you're in Toronto, for example, just if we're going back and forth, there's actually a requirement. If it's not for an accommodation reason, you need to have an employee, if they're not vaccinated, undergo an education session, right? Or in most cases, you'll have to have an employee undergo an education session and show proof that they have gone through that education session. So certainly in that context as well, depending on the local jurisdiction that you're within, the reason why an employee is not vaccinated will become relevant. Second question then, Mark, maybe I'll ask to you. What information is appropriate for managers to be aware of in managing the attestation compliance piece? Specifically, can a manager be aware of a staff member not completing a vaccination attestation form?
Sure, thanks for that. Generally for privacy and confidentiality reasons, an employee's vaccination status should be disclosed to as few people as possible. So, obviously this will vary depending on the way an organization is structured. But for example, if you have an organization with a dedicated human resources department, ideally they should be the only ones who are aware of somebody's vaccination status, and it shouldn't be disseminated, to their managers unless it's absolutely necessary to implement health and safety requirements, to administer the policy, or things of that nature. There may be other sort of operational requirements where somebody needs to have proof of vaccination to be able to attend a client's workplace. But, so there are some exceptions, but generally it should be avoided providing that information to managers should generally be avoided as much as possible. And sorry, Seth, was there a second part to that question?
Well, specifically, can a manager be aware of a staff member not completing a vaccination attestation form? So attesting to the fact that they've gotten vaccinated.
They may be involved in, if there's any progressive discipline being implemented, or they may just, in certain circumstances need to be made aware that an employee is being placed on an unpaid leave of absence. But, for example, if an employee is being placed on an unpaid leave of absence, because the employer can't determine if they're vaccinated or not, and they might be presenting a health and safety risk, it's not strictly necessary to tell the manager why they're being placed on the unpaid leave of absence. They might, kind of surmise the reason, but again, for, confidentiality and privacy reasons, we're talking about, personal information, health information, particularly if we're dealing with people who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons. So again, as much as possible, if it's feasible, in your organization, this type of information should be shared with as few people as possible.
I totally agree. And I would echo Mark that I think it depends on the circumstances. It depends on the workplace you're in, right? And how closely a manager is managing the workforce and the compliance with your COVID-19 health and safety protocols. Because like Mark and I both mentioned before, you still have an obligation, even if you have a fully vaccinated or mostly vaccinated workplace, you still have an obligation to meet your more general health and safety obligations, which includes those COVID-19 guidelines and recommendations implemented on a provincial or local level. So if a manager is responsible for monitoring that and potentially having to do progressive discipline as a result of that, certainly the vaccination status is going to become relevant, right? Because if there's a rule that's specific to vaccinated or unvaccinated individuals, if the manager has to discipline in relation to that and enforce it, they're necessarily going to have to know who is vaccinated and who isn't vaccinated within their particular workforce. But in some cases, that may not be the case, and the manager may not need to know this information. Let me go on to the next question here, Mark. If we're not required to have a vaccination policy in my workplace, are we even allowed to ask if employees are vaccinated for purposes of an upcoming event? So I'm assuming just more generally, are you allowed to ask if an employee is vaccinated? It kind of gets back, I think, to the first question we covered. It's very similar. Again, there's the strict legal requirements, and I think you've touched on that in your question here, where you would need to get that proof of vaccination from employees, and that's actually a legal requirement. However, in the course of meeting your health and safety and duties and your addressing your operational concerns in your particular workplace, you may want to implement a vaccination policy. And as part of that, a necessary aspect of the vaccination policy is going to be confirming vaccination status with individuals. So you can confirm what rights and obligations people have in the workplace and what procedures they have to adhere to. I would say that would be my answer to that one. Mark, do you have anything to add there, though?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, even if an employer doesn't have an explicit right to require employees to disclose their vaccination status, arguably it's often going to be necessary for them to meet their more general obligation to take every reasonable precaution for the health and safety of workers. That's a requirement that applies across Canada under various occupational health and safety legislation. And not only that, even beyond that, where there are operational requirements where the person can't do their job depending on whether or not they're vaccinated. For example, if they work with, they're attending client sites or other places where, like a university campus, where they can't be there if they're not vaccinated. Obviously, the employer needs to know that. And, so it's necessary for operational reasons for them to do their job for that to be disclosed. So I think in both of those circumstances, it would be reasonable. But obviously, it'll depend. Just to make that clear.
Totally agree with that. That's a great example. Let's get into testing. There's a couple of questions here on testing as I sort through the questions here. First is, maybe I'll flip this to you, Mark. Are we allowed to ask about the results of testing?
So absolutely. I mean, okay, first off, I need to make clear that, where you impose testing requirements on existing employees and where that's not legally required, there is some constructive dismissal risk because, that could be considered a substantial unilateral change to the terms of their employment. Where it is legally required, the constructive dismissal risk is far lower. But, where you do have a testing requirement, in my view, you should be requiring them to disclose their results to someone at the organization. Ideally, one person or one department, keeping these things confidential as possible. Because otherwise, you're not going to get a lot of value out of the testing requirement if you're not made aware of what the results are. So, subject to treating that information as confidentially as possible. I think that that's generally, if you're going to bother with having a testing requirement at all, that's what you should do. And in fact, employers who are required to have testing requirements, that is built right in that they need to, provide proof of negative results to their employer before attending the workplace. And I would also just note, Another important consideration to keep in mind when it comes to testing policies is who's paying for them. That constructive dismissal risk that I mentioned before is going to be elevated if the employer is forcing the employees to pay for these tests themselves. So, there's a lot of provincial programs that, provide free COVID-19 tests to workplaces, in some cases in all industries, and other provinces only in certain industries. But if at all possible, if you're going to implement a COVID-19 testing requirement that is not legally required, if at all possible, the employer should, try to pay for it just to minimize their exposures. But obviously that's subject to, financial considerations and what have you.
Could not agree more. You beat me to the punch there. I was going to say it sort of defeats the purpose of having the testing policy in the first place if you don't actually ask for those test results, right? So echo everything Mark said. Just to put a little pause here in our Q&A, recognizing that we're actually at 1:01 right now, we're past time, past the scheduled webinar timing here. I would just like to thank those who can't stay on for the additional portion of the Q&A. We will stay on for a bit longer to address some of the other questions as they continue to trickle in. So thank you everyone for joining us today. If you can't be on right now, vaccination and testing really is one of the most challenging issues that we've seen in Canadian workplaces right now. So we encourage you to take the time to stay on top of the legal developments here. I think we've mentioned Mark in the legal landscape and sort of the guidance that is coming down from the government that relates to vaccination. Take the time to stay on top of the rapidly evolving area. And also feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, need any guidance as you navigate the risks related to workplace vaccinations. So thank you very much, everyone, if you can't stay on. But for everyone who can stay, we will continue to field your questions right now, and I will get into the next question. And maybe I'll handle this, and then Mark, you can jump in afterwards. Do you foresee religious exemptions for the vaccine, something that will be valid, or will these be reviewed on a case-by-case scenario? Anytime you're dealing with an accommodation matter, I think it's always a case-by-case scenario. There's not necessarily going to be a blanket answer there, right? What an appropriate accommodation will be, like whether someone requires an accommodation based on their medical condition or whether they require it in relation to a religious belief or a creed-based basis. That's going to depend on the particular circumstances. It's going to depend on the requirement, right, that the employees allegedly cannot comply with, and the restrictions that are imposed by their code-based or human rights-based protected ground. So when it comes to vaccines and religious exemptions, I do think there are going to be some religion and creed-based reasons why an employee legitimately cannot get vaccinated, right? Because essentially their belief system precludes them from receiving the vaccination. Now, there is a legal test that comes behind when that legal threshold is met, right, to be a creed-based accommodation ground. There are a number of factors that go into that. One of the factors is whether it's part of a larger religious or creed-based organization, right, and where there's a commonly held belief among these people, and that's likely something that will be considered if this issue is ultimately litigated. So there are a number of factors that will go into consideration there. However, like I mentioned, or like we both mentioned earlier, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has already come out and said that essentially a personal belief, a singular belief, or a preference against vaccinations, against mask wearing, COVID-related protocols, that's not going to qualify, right? So there's a legal threshold, and an employee is going to have to meet that threshold if they essentially want to pursue an accommodation claim. And to your point, absolutely, it'll be addressed on a case-by-case scenario. It depends on the creed basis. It depends on the particular religious or creed basis you're asserting, and it'll depend on the circumstances.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Seth. I would just add, I think it's important to recognize, there is some variation across provinces in terms of what the protected ground is. As Seth mentioned earlier, in Ontario, it is creed, which is, quite broad. It's beyond just religious beliefs. And, more importantly, I've spoken to a lot of clients where, they say, I'm not aware of any religions that actually, say you can't be vaccinated. Where does that say that? What's the proof we need? Do they need a pastor or someone to, sign something for them? And ultimately, it doesn't, for somebody to have a legitimate, creed-based exemption, it doesn't need to say it somewhere in their holy book, thou shalt not be vaccinated. They just need to have a sincerely and consistently held belief that their religion or creed does prevent them from being vaccinated. And, in terms of proof of this, because obviously this is a avenue that we've seen a lot of employees who just don't want to get vaccinated, try to use as a loophole to get around their workplace requirements. You can require employees to provide a signed statement attesting to their sincerely and consistently held belief. And, where it's a questionable claim, a sort of a questionable basis, you can ask additional questions. But to be clear, employers need to address every accommodation request in good faith. You should not just reject an accommodation request on, when you first receive it. If you have reason to believe that it's, disingenuous for whatever reason, that, provides reason to do some follow-up. You can ask some questions, have them explain, why exactly their religion or creed prevents them from being vaccinated. But, all of these things need to be addressed in good faith.
Absolutely. Next question, Mark. I think this relates to something you said near the end of the presentation, so I'll put it to you. What is meant when you say an employer needs to reserve their right to progressive discipline in their employment contract?
So all that means is that basically somewhere in the employment agreement, it says, the employer has the right to discipline you. Like, by signing the employment agreement, the employee is agreeing to that. So, because if they don't agree to that, that's not, the common law doesn't consider that to be a right that employers just have no matter what. So, the upshot is if you don't have something like that in your employment agreement, or, there's other kind of circumstances where, for example, if they've been disciplined multiple times in the past and accepted it, that could create an implied right to discipline. But, generally, if you haven't reserved the right to discipline by having the employee agree in their employment agreement that you're allowed to discipline them, there is risk that it could be constructive dismissal. It won't necessarily be constructive dismissal in every case. It's going to depend on what the discipline was, what it was for, what have you. But it's something to bear in mind that if you don't, especially employers who don't have any written employment agreements in place, they can face liability if they discipline employees.
Absolutely. Reserve the right in the employment agreement. Next question. If someone has a medical exemption, would they still be required to do regular testing? I guess I'll give a first answer here. If someone does have a human rights ground, a medical-based human rights ground in which they can't get vaccinated, absolutely, regular testing would be very likely be considered to be a reasonable accommodation in the circumstances. Now, of course, that also is subject to any further requirements, whether testing would invoke any further medical complications as well. You would also have to consider that if the employee receives medical information that says, well, I can't get tested either on a regular basis, that's something else you're going to want to consider as an employer. But absolutely, regular testing is probably one of the most effective accommodations you could come up with in the circumstances. And again, it's one of the more common we're starting to see. And depending on the local jurisdiction you're within, if you don't have a mandatory vaccination policy, you could actually be legally required to implement testing procedures, right? There are certain sectors Mark touched on where testing is required at this time if a vaccination is not in place. So again, you need to stay on top of the requirements in your sector and within your jurisdiction. But certainly you would, whenever a medical issue is at play, with respect to vaccination, you need to explore potential accommodations, and testing is certainly one of the first areas you may want to look to because it's something that could potentially meet your health and safety concerns, right? But also allow the employee to continue working. You're meeting your obligations as well to that employee to accommodate them to the point of undue hardship.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, I would just note, as Seth mentioned, for example, in Ontario, you have these sector-specific requirements for, childcare, schools, healthcare facilities, things of that nature. And, under those requirements, which are, legal requirements, even if somebody can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, they still have to do the testing. So, there is a basis there. And obviously the rationale for the testing is to ensure health and safety in the workplace. And, the reason that somebody's not vaccinated doesn't really change that rationale. If they're not vaccinated, the testing is, there to serve a purpose. And that is to, take every reasonable precaution to ensure that you're not having employees spread COVID-19 to others in the workplace, whether they be coworkers or, clients, or the public at large.
Next question. I think I'll turn this to you because it's also relevant to some things you've touched on today, Mark. Starts off, thanks for the concise info. Well, thank you for attending. What are the issues in an office environment, knowing who is vaccinated and who is not? Don't employees need to know vaccination information? Is the employer responsible for, well, let's break it down maybe. Maybe let's start with that. Is there an issue in the office environment knowing who is vaccinated and who is not vaccinated? And do all employees need to know?
So, I mean, it can certainly be necessary in certain office environments. I will note not all office environments are the same. And it also depends, where the office is located and what jurisdiction. So, the real consideration here is it necessary for this to be disclosed, for the employer to ensure that they have appropriate health and safety measures in place. And, in the vast majority of cases, I'd say that would be the case. And not only that, if your office is in Toronto, for example, employees are legally required to disclose whether or not they're vaccinated. And there's other jurisdictions like that as well. So again, it's going to vary depending on the office's location and the way it's set up. You may have an office that's structured in such a way that people have very little contact with one another. Everyone has large offices, very wide hallways. If there's no legal requirement, it might not be strictly necessary, but it's probably a good idea to have anyway, because the legal requirements have been changing so much and they're increasingly differentiating between vaccinated and unvaccinated people. So if there's new legal requirements that come into effect, all of a sudden without notice, as has been happening lately, you'd rather be in a position where you know who's vaccinated, not so that you can comply with those legal requirements and you don't need to play catch up. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Seth.
Yeah, I agree. I think it depends on the case. In an office environment, we're talking about potentially, well, like you said, how close are people working together, right? But I don't think necessarily it's a necessary thing towards a vaccination policy that all employees know the vaccination status of the other employees, right? We want to get back to the confidential information, right? I mean, to me, you don't want to expose vaccination information beyond the extent that you have to, right? In any situation. I think as an employer, you're being most risk averse if you're protecting this information to the greatest extent possible and not disclosing it beyond that which you have to, right? And we touched on earlier, some of the earlier questions, does a manager need to know about vaccination status? In some cases they might, right? It depends on the workplace. If they are in charge of monitoring workplace safety protocols in relation to COVID-19, yeah, absolutely. It's reasonable to have a manager know of this information. But otherwise, if there's no sort of monitoring of COVID-19 health and safety protocols, I wouldn't necessarily say it's employees need to know that information. In some cases, you may actually want to not. In most cases, unless it's actually if there's a rationale, unless there's a rationale for doing so, you likely don't want to give that information away, because that's just asking for potential issues for any, like when we're talking about harassment and discrimination claims and what have you. Disseminating vaccination status broadly is just sort of asking for trouble as an employer, in my view.
I completely agree. Sorry, I realized I was really only speaking to the first half of the question. Yeah, as Seth said, this is personal, health information, really. So I mean, not only should it not be disclosed, I mean, other employees in the workplace have no right to know whether other people are vaccinated or not. So, and I recognize the reason that, a lot of employees do want to know it. It's for their own health and safety. So in those circumstances, the employer should really rely on their policy. And this is part of the reason you want to have a vaccination policy and other COVID health and safety policies in place so that you can, show all the measures that you've taken to ensure health and safety in the workplace, that you've taken every reasonable step so that it's really just not necessary for them to know whether any given person is vaccinated or not. You've done all of these things and that's what you should really kind of rely on.
Totally. And again, we've seen an uptick, really. We really have seen an uptick in harassment and discrimination claims that specifically relate to vaccination status, right? Conduct, comments that people are making to one another. There's a high level of anxiety right now, as many of us know. We see it in the news. There's anti-vaxxer groups, and there are vaccinated people who feel very strongly that people should get vaccinated at this time. So as a result, keeping that information as contained as possible. I agree with you, Mark. Very important. Next and last question, because we're running out of time here, and in respect for the rest of people's days, we'll come to the last question. Is the government providing online free education to those who refuse to get vaccinated, or should the business be responsible for providing it? Well, there are resources available. Many governments have offered free education not webinars, but modules, if you will. So sort of instructional, sort of like PowerPoint presentations that you can go through. And at the end, you get a certificate that you can show your employer that you've gone through that training session. One free example relevant for GTA employers, City of Toronto has a module. It's free. It's on the City of Toronto's website. It can be accessed by anyone. I've completed it myself just to see how it works. And really, so the government is releasing these types of free education seminars. Look for them within your local jurisdiction. Often there are some specific points that the education needs to speak to, such as the benefits of vaccination, side effects of vaccination, certain things like that. It depends on the jurisdiction you're within, but there are certain elements of that. So if you're an employer, you're free to implement your own education session. You can use the free ones, but if you want to implement your own education session, you need to make sure, though, that education session touches on the minimum requirements that are imposed by the local jurisdiction you're within. I don't know if you'd add to that, Mark.
I think I would just add that, it will vary, if you want to implement these educational sessions, even if you're not legally required. In those circumstances, you're really free to kind of do whatever you think is best. But, where, as Seth mentioned, where these educational sessions are required for employees who aren't vaccinated, such as, in Toronto, in certain sectors like childcare sectors, there is generally, 5 areas that it needs to touch on. So, if you're not going to use one of the ones provided by the City of Toronto or the Ministry of Education, things like that, you need to ensure that all those points are met.
Okay, well, that's our final question for today. We'd like to wrap up here. As I mentioned, feel free to reach out to us if you do have any questions as you're keeping on track of the updates and the guidance that's being handed down by the government at this time, and as the legal requirements sort of continue to shift, because this is an area that continues to shift. It's a novel thing, COVID-19, vaccinations in the workplace. It hasn't really been done before, right? So the law is going to continue to change here in this area. If you do need guidance, please feel free to reach out. Here's my email, here's Mark's email. Anytime, please feel free to reach out. Everyone who's participated, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And everyone have a nice day.